For nearly 200,000 years, human life was simple, raw, immediate. You hunted what you could, you gathered what you needed. You survived each day, one sunset at a time, and for the vast majority of our time on Earth, that's all we did, survive. But then something changed. Not in our bones, not in our muscles, but in our minds. And that shift, barely perceptible at first, ignited a spark that would lead to the birth of every empire, every story, every invention that has ever shaped our world. It's not a moment you'll find in most history books. There was no explosion, no grand monument to mark it. But around 70,000 years ago, a transformation began, one that turned us from clever apes into myth-makers, explorers and architects of civilization. This was the beginning of cognitive revolution. Before this, early humans behaved much like other animals. They had tools, yes. They made fire. They even had language. But something was missing. Something fundamental. They didn't leave behind much art. No signs of ritual. No indication they were thinking beyond the here and now. But then, we started dreaming. Not in sleep, in story. Somewhere in East Africa, maybe by a fire, someone told a tale that wasn't about the immediate world. It was about something imagined. A spirit, a warning, a hope, and someone else remembered it. Then they passed it on. Then someone else added a twist. And just like that, humans began to build mythology. This wasn't trivial. It was a leap. Because storytelling did what no tool or fire ever could. It let us collaborate in larger numbers. You see, humans can only maintain close, stable relationships with about 150 people. The Dunbar number, that's the limit our brains can handle when it comes to tracking social bonds. But once we could believe in shared fictions, in gods, totems, legends, we could unite thousands, even millions. Religion, culture, laws, these are stories. And they were our first great technology. It's no coincidence that not long after this narrative explosion, humans began to do something we'd never done before. We left. We migrated out of Africa, across vast and dangerous landscapes, into territories unknown. These weren't random wanderings. They were coordinated journeys powered by memory, language, and shared belief. Archaeological evidence shows that humans reached Australia by boat nearly 65,000 years ago. That's an open sea crossing, requiring sophisticated tools, knowledge of tides, and most crucially, collective memory. Because survival wasn't just about skill anymore. It was about what you knew and who remembered it. And the earliest real memory banks, they weren't scrolls. They weren't stones. They were people. Tribal elders, shamans, hunters, mothers, each carried a piece of cultural code passed down through song, symbol, or scar. This was the birth of distributed cognition. No single person knew it all, but the group as a whole did. That's what made us unstoppable. Like a where Neanderthals remained tied to specific territories, reliant on environmental knowledge that couldn't travel, Homo sapiens transferred memory through culture. We could move, adapt, and bring our intelligence with us. By 40,000 years ago, the cognitive revolution was in full force. We started painting on cave walls, not just animals, but stories, rituals, symbols that spoke to something greater than survival. In places like Chauvet, Lascaux, and Sulawesi, we find evidence of deep imagination. Lions with human heads, hands reaching out in red ochre, herds frozen mid-gallop. These weren't decorations, they were transmissions. They said, we were here, we saw, we imagined. And from imagination came complexity. Around the same time, humans began to craft figurines, often of animals or fertility goddesses like the Venus of Willendorf. These figures weren't toys, they were part of something larger, a ritual mind, beginning to grasp symbolism, projection, perhaps even the divine. And all this happened before agriculture, before cities, before writing. It happened when we were still hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, chasing herds across grasslands. Because what changed the world wasn't the plow, it was the mindset. A mindset capable of abstraction, memory, and myth. But with this great leap came a cost. The more we remembered, the more we feared, the more we imagined, the more we suffered. For the first time, humans could envision their own death, not just in the moment, but years in advance. We became aware of our fragility, of our place in the cosmos, of how small and temporary we really were. And so we invented gods. Not because we were ignorant, but because we needed something bigger than ourselves. Something that could anchor the chaos, give order to pain, justify the unknown. From that fear, religion was born. Alongside it came burial rituals, ancestor worship, and moral codes. But at the root of it all was memory. Memory not as a personal trait, but as a social technology. Because those who forgot didn't survive, and those who remembered well enough to teach others, they shaped the future. This was the true beginning of civilization. Not bricks, not grain, but memory. Shared, taught, passed down, generation after generation. We were no longer just animals. We were time travelers, sending our ideas across centuries through story and song. And the journey had just begun. As the human mind continued evolving, something even more profound happened. We stopped just storing memory inside ourselves and began designing external vessels for it. Before this, knowledge was passed only through words, song, and demonstration. You had to be present with the teacher. You had to hear the story with your own ears, watch the fire built with your own eyes. But with time, memory began to detach. We invented symbols, patterns, marks that meant something more than they appeared to. The first true writing systems were still far away, but even early on our ancestors began to experiment with proto-writing. Take the Blombos Cave, Ochre, for instance. Found in South Africa and dated to around 75,000 years ago, it features a cross-hatched pattern carved into a piece of red ochre. At first glance it looks like art, but many researchers believe it was more than decoration. It was intentional notation, an attempt to encode information outside the mind. This marked a turning point. Because the moment information can exist independent of the body, it gains resilience. It can survive drought, famine, war. It can be transferred across time without being distorted by memory loss, illness, or death. And more than that, it can be amplified. You can refine it, build on it, add layers. This was the beginning of knowledge as architecture. Over time, these early symbols became more structured. In Mesopotamia, Sumerians would eventually create cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets to track goods, debts, offerings. At first it was practical, accounting, logistics, trade, but it quickly grew into something more powerful, history. People were no longer just remembering what happened, they were recording why. This shift, when memory became written narrative, redefined everything. Because now, power wasn't just in the strong or the brave, it was in the literate. Those who could encode memory onto stone or clay held the keys to legacy, law, and leadership. It's no coincidence that scribes in ancient Egypt were among the most respected members of society. They weren't warriors, they weren't priests, but they could preserve truth or manipulate it, and that made them indispensable. Memory had evolved from a trait into a tool, and then into a weapon, and this had massive consequences. Because for the first time, knowledge could be owned. If you had the tablet, the scroll, the codex, you had control. You didn't need to convince someone through argument or tradition. You just pointed to the record and said, "It is written." And if it was written, it must be true. This created a new hierarchy. One not based on brute strength or age, but on access to memory. The literate became gatekeepers. Priests, kings, record keepers. They controlled the past, shaped the present, and influenced the future. And it all hinged on one thing: the human mind's belief in permanence. But here's the twist. Even as writing exploded, spreading through Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China, most people still couldn't read. The average farmer or builder in Babylon or Thebes didn't have access to this written memory. They lived in a world filtered through interpreters, priests, scribes, rulers. So in a strange way, even though knowledge had been externalized, it hadn't been democratized. The few held the memory of the many, and this created a tension that would echo through history, the battle between oral culture and written authority. Oral cultures evolve with time. Stories shift, myths adapt to new audiences. They remain fluid, alive, but written culture demands stasis. It says, "This is how it was, forever." And so began the myth of the unchanging truth. But truth was never static. It has always been shaped, bent, rewritten. Just ask the scribes who chiseled pharaohs' names into stone. only to later erase them from history when dynasties fell. They didn't just preserve memory, they controlled it. They decided who would be remembered and who would be forgotten. Even today, we're still reckoning with that, because modern history is written on paper, on servers, in databases, and while we pretend it's objective, it's still filtered, still curated. We've just changed the scribes from priests to programmers. And so, the fundamental question remains: who gets to write memory? Who gets to erase it? Who owns the past? Because whoever answers those questions owns the future. By the time humans began writing memory into clay, stone, and scroll, something new began to emerge. Not just organization, not just record keeping, but empire. Because if you can standardize memory, you can scale it. And that's exactly what early civilizations did. In Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, writing was the backbone of administration. Without it, no cities could function. How else could you track taxes, manage irrigation, enforce law, or record lineage? But more than that, writing let rulers do something even more dangerous. They could shape the past. When Hammurabi of Babylon carved his laws into stone, it wasn't just to enforce order. It was to declare, this is justice, this is truth. And because it was written, that truth could not be questioned. Or at least, that was the illusion. In Egypt, pharaohs went further. They didn't just write history, they rewrote it. If a successor came to power and hated their predecessor, they simply erased their name from monuments, temples, even tombs. To the ancient Egyptian mind, this wasn't just political, it was cosmic. Your name had to be remembered to exist in the afterlife. To erase a name wasn't just a slight, it was soul murder. This wasn't metaphor, it was doctrine. So memory didn't just organize the living, it controlled the dead. But the real genius of early empire wasn't just in storing memory, it was in making people believe it was sacred. Writing wasn't casual, it was mystical. In Mesopotamia, scribes trained for decades. In Egypt, they were initiated into temple schools. In India, the Vedas were memorized syllable by syllable, breath by breath, with perfect pitch and timing. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about reverence. Because if the written word was divine, then those who controlled it were closer to the gods. This created a cognitive caste system, the literate at the top, the spoken at the bottom. And from that division, power crystallized. Kings ruled not just with armies, but with memory monopolies. They could declare ancestry, tracing back to gods. They could inscribe victory even after defeat. They could define law, dictate myth, and declare enemies as heretics, not through proof, but through script. And once it was carved in stone, who could argue? Even rebellions couldn't fight it. You could burn a city, you could kill a king, but unless you rewrote the records, the memory remained. That's why conquerors like the Assyrians, and later the Persians, would do more than seize territory. They would seize archives, temple scrolls, court records, genealogies, because to control the memory of a people was to own them. But with this power came paranoia. Every ruling class lived in fear of false memory, of heresy, of propaganda, and so they built systems of censorship and surveillance. In Egypt, scribes weren't just recorders, they were watchers. They monitored rituals, reported disloyalty, and recorded infractions in sacred scrolls never shown to the public. In China, imperial historians were expected to write 2 versions of every event, one for the emperor, one for the archives. The emperor's version was flattering, the archival one, brutal. And here's the twist. Emperors knew this. They allowed it, because they wanted control of perception, not truth. As long as people believed the illusion of memory, that what's written must be real, they didn't need to fear reality. They only needed to manage narrative. And this idea that memory can be engineered didn't die with the ancients. It lives on today, in every history book, every news cycle, every feed that curates your past for you. Because memory isn't just what you recall, it's what you're told to recall. And the people telling you, they're still scribes, just with different tools. Not reed pens or chisels, but keyboards, algorithms, cloud servers. The memory machine didn't stop, it evolved, and we're still inside it. And as the world's first empires refined writing, a disturbing transformation began. What started as a tool to preserve knowledge became a weapon to shape minds. Memory, once organic and free-flowing, was now engineered. This shift was subtle at first. Rulers simply used writing to glorify their deeds, but over time they began using it to reshape reality itself. The pharaoh didn't just record history, he became history. Scribes didn't just write facts, they sculpted identity, and priests didn't just preserve tradition, they programmed obedience. And the target of this new weapon wasn't just the body, it was the mind. Let's start in ancient Mesopotamia. Cuneiform tablets recovered from Nippur and Ul show detailed records of children's education. These weren't playful school exercises. They were scripts, memorization drills for loyalty, law, and lineage. You didn't just learn to write. You learned what to believe. Children were taught not just to read names of gods, but to fear them. Not just to count harvests, but to accept tribute as divine order. The earliest schools weren't places of curiosity. They were institutes of indoctrination. And the method? Repetition. Over and over, students copied the same texts. One clay tablet from 3,500 years ago features a schoolboy's punishment record. 50 lines of "I will not speak against my master," each line etched by hand. This wasn't about learning. It was about submission. In Egypt, it went further. Temple schools trained scribes to memorize entire lifetimes of ritual. They weren't just copying prayers, they were embedding cognitive scripts into themselves. Every movement, every word, every breath, timed to match sacred rhythm. To deviate was to corrupt the ritual, and to corrupt the ritual was to bring chaos into the world. So what did that do to the mind? It turned memory into rigid code. There was no room for innovation. No permission to question. Only recall. And if you couldn't recall, you were useless to the machine. Even outside temples, this control persisted. In China's early dynasties, memory was tied to virtue. To be a filial son wasn't just a personal trait. It was a memorized identity, reinforced through Confucian texts. Those who failed to recite the classics weren't just seen as ignorant, they were branded immoral. Because forgetting wasn't a flaw, it was a sin. In India, the Vedic tradition took this to an extreme. Brahmin priests memorized sacred hymns down to syllables, tones, even the pauses between sounds. Oral transmission was so precise, modern linguists say it preserved language structure better than written Sanskrit ever did. But why? Because memory wasn't just sacred, it was authority. If you knew the hymns, you had power. If you forgot them, you lost it. The same was true in Greece. In Sparta, boys were trained to recall oral law under pain of beating, not just for education, but for obedience. And in all of these cultures, forgetting became the ultimate taboo, because to forget was to break the chain, to interrupt the ritual, to misalign the stars, to anger the gods. Memory, once a gift, became a burden, a cage, a filter, and the keepers of memory? They were no longer just scribes, they were programmers of society. But as memory became more rigid, another problem emerged. What happens when memory no longer fits reality? When the written laws fail the hungry? When the sacred stories contradict lived experience? Now we see the cracks. Because controlled memory cannot evolve, it cannot adapt, it can only repeat. And when it breaks, it shatters hard. The rebellions that followed across Babylon, Egypt, China, weren't just political, they were cognitive revolts. People fighting not just rulers, but the stories imposed on them. And we see it today too. Modern propaganda doesn't look like scrolls. It looks like headlines, hashtags, infographics. But the function is the same. Curate memory, compress complexity, create obedience. Because when you control what people remember, you control who they are. And that control, it always begins with repetition. The same slogans, the same photos, the same phrases, until memory becomes mantra, and mantra becomes identity, and identity becomes compliance. So the next time you scroll past a headline you've seen 1,000 times, ask yourself, is this information? Or is this cognitive architecture, shaping the world inside my head? Because memory isn't just what you store, it's what you're taught to accept. As civilizations grew more complex, so did their obsession with memory. But not just memory of the present, not even of the past. What they wanted, what they feared losing, was immortality. Because as the ancients etched their victories into stone and their laws into clay, they weren't just documenting facts, they were attempting something far more ambitious: to outlive death. It's easy to forget how much of history was written in the shadow of mortality. People lived short, brutal lives: war, famine, disease, always one step behind. So the desire to be remembered wasn't vanity, it was salvation. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife wasn't a mystery, it was a system. You lived, you died. Your heart was weighed against a feather, and if your name was remembered, if your deeds were spoken, you could pass into eternity. But if your name was forgotten, you were erased. Not just from earth, but from existence. So kings built pyramids, priests wrote spells, families paid scribes to inscribe names onto tomb walls, hoping those symbols would echo through time like a divine password. This wasn't just ritual, it was data redundancy. Write the name in enough places, and maybe, just maybe, it survives the flood of history. But that survival came at a cost, because the pursuit of eternal memory required eternal hierarchy. Only the elite could afford scribes. Only the powerful had the resources to commission statues, temples, or scrolls, and only they were remembered. The rest? Forgotten. Ashes. Silence. So immortality wasn't just about memory, it was about access. And this truth, this brutal truth, has echoed across every age. In Greece, poets like Homer became the memory banks of entire cultures. But who paid Homer? Who preserved his words? The aristocracy, the city-states, the generals. And what stories did he tell? Not of farmers or mothers, but of kings and wars. In Rome, emperors minted coins with their faces, built arches with their names, and funded historians to glorify their reigns. Some even commissioned false victories, wars they didn't win, battles they never fought. But because they were recorded, they became real. And when emperors fell, their names were erased from inscriptions, their statues defaced, their legacies rewritten. They called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. To be forgotten was the greatest punishment Rome could inflict. Worse than exile, worse than execution. Because if you weren't remembered, you never existed. But here's the dark twist. While the powerful fought to preserve their memory, the people beneath them, the workers, the servants, the enslaved, became invisible. Their names were not written, their lives not recorded, their deaths not mourned. They became the price of memory. And that trade has never stopped. Even today, the stories that survive are the ones with money behind them. The winners write history not because they're right, but because they can. They have the microphones, the printing presses, the platforms, and we scroll, we echo, we repeat, because repetition, we've learned, equals truth. But what if it doesn't? What if immortality isn't a gift but a curse? Because the more we try to preserve, the more we distort, the more we chase permanence, the more we lose the fluid living memory that made us human in the first place. We become trapped in our own echoes, repeating myths, enforcing old truths, cementing old power. And so we must ask, in our quest to be remembered, have we forgotten what matters? In every society that rose and fell across ancient history, one theme always emerged. Stories weren't just tales, they were tactics. Because if you could control what people remembered, you could control what they believed. And once you controlled belief, you didn't need armies. You had narrative supremacy. The earliest rulers understood this instinctively. They didn't just conquer territory, they conquered time. By rewriting the past, they shaped the present. By shaping the present, they secured the future. This is how empires built identity. Think about how the Egyptians told their history. Their pharaohs were gods. Their enemies were chaos incarnate. Every war was not just territorial, it was cosmic. To fight a rival nation wasn't just strategy, it was restoring Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. So what does that do to a population? It fuses memory with morality. If your king fights evil, then to oppose the king is to oppose the gods. That's ideological armor, forged not in steel, but in scrolls. The same thing happened in China. During the Zhou dynasty, rulers invoked the mandate of heaven, a divine right to rule, passed from one dynasty to the next. But if you lost favor, if floods or famines struck, then heaven had withdrawn its mandate. And how did people know? And records. The official court historians didn't just describe events, they judged them. Every natural disaster was interpreted as a cosmic signal. Every uprising was woven into a narrative of legitimacy or failure. And that narrative? It shaped succession. It shaped loyalty. It shaped how people remembered their own suffering. Because if your famine was a punishment from heaven, you didn't protest. You repented. That's the power of story. It turns oppression into destiny. Rome mastered this. Julius Caesar, writing in the third person, glorified his own conquests in the Commentari de Bello Gallico. It wasn't a dry military report. It was a campaign ad, a story of heroism, order, and civilization triumphing over barbarism. Never mind that barbarism often meant peaceful tribes simply defending their land. The narrative prevailed. And because Caesar wrote it himself, his version of history became canonical. He didn't just win on the battlefield. He won in the collective memory of his empire. And yet, the people who suffered under these stories, the conquered, the silenced, were not simply erased. They remembered too, but they remembered differently. Oral traditions flourished among the oppressed. Songs, laments, whispered stories passed through generations, not written but deeply felt. Stories not of glory but of grief. And that's important, because not all memory is made of stone. Some of it is kept alive in defiance. One of the most powerful examples, the Jewish exile after the Babylonian conquest. With their temple destroyed and their leaders taken captive, the Hebrews began to compile what would become the Hebrew Bible, not as a triumphant chronicle, but as a memory of survival. They didn't glorify their kings. They documented their failings, their idolatry, their exile, their grief. Why? Because in a world where memory had been hijacked by power, the greatest rebellion was to remember truthfully, even painfully. This is the double edge of memory. It can be used to enslave or to liberate. It all depends on who tells the story and who's allowed to hear it. That's why regimes throughout history have always targeted memory first. Burn the books, ban the songs, control the curriculum, because you don't need to kill people if you can kill their memory. Which brings us to today. We like to think we're past all this, that our history is objective, that our data is neutral. But algorithms are storytellers now. And they don't tell tales to preserve memory. They tell tales to profit from attention. That's the new battlefront. A war not over territory, but over narrative space. A war where truth is optional. And memory is whatever gets the most engagement. So ask yourself, when you scroll, are you remembering? Or are you being remembered for? Because in this war, the prize isn't land, it's your mind. There's a strange truth about memory that history rarely tells. Sometimes the most powerful thing a society can do is forget. As humans began building more complex civilizations, bigger cities, more people, denser networks, the memory systems we once relied on began to crack. Not because we remembered too little, but because we remembered too much. Imagine living in a village of 50 people. Every face is familiar. Every story, every betrayal, every act of kindness, you know it all. There's no anonymity, no hiding. Now imagine living in a city of 50,000. Strangers pass you by every second. Faces blur, stories vanish. You begin to forget, not just others, but yourself. And that's not an accident, it's necessary. Because complex societies require forgetting. They need it to function, to reset, to move on. Let's start with debt. In the ancient Sumerian city of Lagash, debt wasn't just a transaction. It was a moral stain. Owe someone grain or silver, and you owed them your loyalty, your time, even your children. Debtors could be enslaved, families broken, entire generations shackled by memory of a deal gone wrong. But the Sumerians also invented something radical: debt forgiveness. Every few decades, rulers would issue a clean slate edict, wiping the memory of debts across the city. This wasn't kindness, it was survival. Because too much memory, the wrong kind of memory, breaks a society. If people are trapped in an endless loop of resentment and repayment, trust collapses, trade halts, social mobility dies. So the king would declare, "Forget." And just like that, old records were burned, slates wiped clean, slaves freed. It was a political reset. But more than that, it was a cognitive reset. This same pattern played out across empires. The Egyptians, meticulous record keepers, had entire classes of scribes whose job wasn't to preserve memory, but to curate it. They'd decide which pharaohs deserved remembrance, which battles were worth retelling, which failures should quietly disappear into the desert. Even their gods weren't safe. When political alliances shifted, old deities were demoted, their temples repurposed, their rituals edited out of holy texts. This wasn't blasphemy. It was bureaucratic theology. A system that understood memory wasn't sacred. It was strategic. And forgetting, that was part of the plan. Rome took it further. As we've seen, they practiced Damdeomephria, not just deleting names, but erasing statues, defacing images, rewriting coins. But they also embraced institutional forgetting. Their legal system recognized the power of letting time soften memory. Statutes of limitations, the idea that after a certain number of years, even crime could be forgotten. Because permanent memory means permanent guilt. And guilt doesn't build empires. Amnesia, when managed well, does. And here's where things get dark. Because once leaders realized the power of forgetting, they weaponized it. They erased rebellions, silenced dissidents, vanished entire populations from official records. They didn't need to kill with swords, they killed with silence. And the people? They played along. Not out of fear, but because forgetting had benefits. It let you avoid trouble, keep your job, stay in the good graces of power. It allowed families to move forward, rebuild, rewrite. And slowly, a new kind of memory emerged. Selective history. Not the full truth. Not lies either. Just curation. A little less here, a little more there. A shift in emphasis, a change in tone. And that's how civilizations learn to survive. Not by remembering everything, but by remembering strategically. It's why nations today can celebrate their victories while downplaying their atrocities. Why schoolbooks teach one version of history while entire communities live another. It's not always malicious. Sometimes forgetting is necessary. To heal, to grow, to keep going. But it's also dangerous. Because when forgetting becomes policy, memory becomes mythology. And the truth gets lost in the dust. In the earliest days, memory was shared. Stories passed from mouth to mouth. Songs echoed through generations. Wisdom was a collective flame, kept alive by everyone, elders, hunters, mothers, even children. But as civilizations grew, something shifted. Memory became specialized. And with that specialization came a new kind of figure, one that would shape human destiny for centuries to come. The historian. Not a historian in the academic sense we know today, but the first class of memory keepers, people whose job wasn't just to remember, but to manage what others remembered. They were scribes in Egypt, court chroniclers in China, temple recorders in Mesopotamia, and what made them powerful wasn't their pen, it was their position, because memory, once centralized, became controlled. Let's start in ancient Egypt. The House of Life per Ankh was more than a library. It was a sanctuary for scribes, a sacred archive where every detail of the pharaoh's reign was recorded, revised and preserved. But not everything made it in. Scribes were taught to omit omens, disguise failures, smooth over rebellions. The pharaoh, after all, was a living god. To write his mistakes was to question divinity. So they wrote not what happened, but what should have happened. And in doing so, they transformed memory into propaganda. In Mesopotamia, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, wasn't just theology, it was politics. It justified Marduk, the city's patron god, as supreme over all others. And who preserved this myth? The priests, the scribes, the sanctioned storytellers. The ones who understood that memory was not passive. It was performative. And the performance had a purpose, to legitimize power. This pattern repeated across time. In ancient China, court historians were required to record the emperor's deeds, but they also kept secret archives, truthful accounts meant for future dynasties. And emperors knew this. There's a famous story of Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty who confronted his historian and asked, "Do you record all my mistakes?" The historian replied, "Yes." The emperor paused, then said, "Good. Why?" Because even the most powerful understood, History isn't just for today, it's a conversation with the future. But here's the tension. Memory keepers are never truly neutral. They have patrons, loyalties, biases, and when memory becomes profession, it becomes politics. Look at the Roman historian Livy. His history of Rome spanned hundreds of years, but it wasn't an objective chronicle. It was a moral fable, glorifying Roman values, sanitizing Rome's darkest acts. And people believed it. Because it was written. That's the power of historians. They don't just document the past. They define its meaning. And their influence didn't end with ancient scribes. It continues today, in textbooks, museums, documentaries, in what's taught, in what's excluded, in who gets a chapter, and who gets a footnote. Because the question isn't just what happened, it's whose version survived. And the answer is almost always the version that served power. So the next time you read history, remember this. You're not reading truth. You're reading someone's memory. For most of history, wars have been fought with weapons. But there's another kind of war, one older, quieter, and far more enduring. It's the war for memory. Not bombs, not bullets, but narratives. Who remembers what, who gets to forget, and who decides which version of the past becomes the official story. Because if you control the past, you can justify the present. You can crown heroes, demonize enemies, sanctify borders. You can erase genocides or manufacture legends. And you can turn war criminals into freedom fighters, or the other way around. And this war isn't fought on battlefields. It's fought in archives, in museums, in speeches, in schoolbooks. Let's go back to post-World War II Europe. After the fall of Nazi Germany, the world confronted an unimaginable atrocity, the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, millions of others. Tortured, exterminated, erased. But when the camps were liberated, something terrifying happened. People didn't believe it. Not all, of course. But enough. Enough to raise a chilling question. How could something so massive be doubted so quickly? The answer? Memory was vulnerable, and it still is. Because memory is not just what happened. It's what gets repeated. And if something isn't repeated, if it's buried, downplayed, silenced, it starts to fade. Even the unimaginable becomes unthinkable. That's why Holocaust survivors rushed to tell their stories. Why memorials were built. Why photographs were taken, films made, testimonies recorded. Not to wallow in trauma, but to protect memory from erasure. Because silence isn't just forgetting, it's an invitation to rewrite. We saw it again in post-colonial Africa. When European powers withdrew, they left behind chaos, not just politically but historically. Colonial archives were incomplete, biased, or intentionally destroyed. Whole nations had to reconstruct their memory from fragments. Who were the true leaders? Who betrayed their people? What crimes were covered up? And the result was a deep historical vacuum, a silence quickly filled by new regimes, each eager to write their own origin story, sometimes for pride, sometimes for propaganda, because power hates a blank page. The same dynamic played out in the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, photographs were routinely altered to erase political enemies. Entire paragraphs vanished from encyclopedias. Even loyal revolutionaries like Trotsky were removed from images, speeches, textbooks. It wasn't enough to kill someone. You had to kill their memory. This practice became so common, Soviet citizens coined a phrase for it, airbrushing history. And the most chilling part, it worked. Within a generation, entire names were forgotten. Not because people didn't care, but because the official version left no trace. This is why dictators fear historians more than rebels. Because once a lie is exposed, once memory is reclaimed, it becomes harder to control the future. But here's the modern twist. Today's memory war isn't waged in secret. It's waged in public, in broad daylight, with hashtags and headlines. And the battlefield is inside your phone. Because now, everyone is a historian. Everyone has a version of the past. Everyone has a platform. And that sounds like freedom, until it becomes noise. Because when every narrative competes for your attention, the truth gets buried, not by force, but by distraction. Real memory doesn't just vanish. It drowns. In misinformation. In spin. In content. So the new war for memory isn't about erasure. It's about overload. And in that chaos, the loudest version wins, not the truest one. So what can we do? Maybe the answer isn't just to remember more. Maybe it's to remember more carefully. To ask, who's telling this story? What do they gain? What do they want me to forget? Because the war for memory is still raging. And it's not fought with weapons. It's fought with attention. If history is written by the victors, then nostalgia is packaged by the survivors. It's one of the most powerful and most deceptive forces in the human mind. Because nostalgia doesn't just make us remember. It makes us long. For a past that may not have even existed. It's memory, wrapped in emotion, edited by time, and weaponized by power. And it's older than you think. Let's start with the Roman Empire. When the Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Europe descended into chaos, famine, feudalism, and fractured kingdoms. But as centuries passed, something strange happened. The memory of Rome began to shine brighter. Not for what it was, but for what people needed it to be. They remembered the roads, the aqueducts, the laws. They forgot the corruption, the brutality, the slavery. And in that selective glow, Rome became a myth. A golden age. A symbol of order. A past worth reviving. That myth would shape European politics for centuries. From the Holy Roman Empire to Mussolini's fascist dream of a new Rome. Nostalgia fueled ambition, justified violence, and blinded people to the present. Because that's what nostalgia does. It simplifies the past, flattens the pain, polishes the rough edges, and in doing so, it distorts. The same thing happened in post-revolution France. After the chaos of the 1790s, guillotines, wars, instability, the French elite longed for grandeur. They looked back to Louis XIV Versailles, the pageantry of monarchy. Never mind the oppression, the inequality, the hunger. The memory was convenient. The reality was irrelevant. And that longing gave rise to Napoleon, a man who promised glory by resurrecting the idea of empire. He wrapped himself in Roman imagery, crowned himself emperor, and told the French people, "We will return to greatness." Sound familiar? Because this pattern repeats again and again. Every time a society faces uncertainty, someone appears promising a return. Not to logic, not to reform, but to a version of memory, edited, airbrushed, and supercharged with emotion. In America, it's the myth of the 1950s. In Britain, it's the Victorian era. In Russia, it's the Soviet past. Each is sold as a time of pride, stability, strength. Each is laced with selective forgetting. Of racism, of repression, of inequality. Because nostalgia isn't memory, it's fantasy marketing. And in the modern age, it's everywhere. But it sells politics. It sells entertainment. It sells identity. Think about the rise of retro culture, vinyl records, vintage fashion, filtered Instagram aesthetics. It's not about quality, it's about feeling. That things were simpler, purer, better. But were they? Or is our brain just editing out the chaos, like an old film reel skipping over the damage? Even in personal life, nostalgia works this way. We remember high school fondly, not the anxiety, but the freedom. We miss our ex, not the fights, but the laughter. We romanticize childhood, not the powerlessness, but the innocence. This is nostalgia's trick. It's not about the past. It's about the present's dissatisfaction. We look back because we don't like what we see forward. And politicians, marketers, and media empires know this. They feed us nostalgia not as memory, but as comfort. Make X great again. Return to tradition. Bring back the glory days. But nostalgia is a sugar-coated memory. It gives us the taste of history without the substance. And the scent of legacy without the burden. And worst of all, it makes us fear the future. Because if the past was perfect, how could tomorrow compete? So we get stuck. This longing, wishing, scrolling through yesterday, instead of building something better. So the next time nostalgia hits, pause, ask yourself, what am I remembering? What am I forgetting? And who benefits from this version of the past? Because memory can guide us. But nostalgia? It can trap us. It can trap us. There was a time long before mirrors, before memoirs, before psychology, when humans didn't think of themselves as selves. Not in the way we do now. They were part of tribes, clans, spirits, totems. The idea of I was always tied to we. But something changed. Slowly, subtly, over millennia, humans began to internalize memory, not just as a tool for survival, but as a map of who they were. And from that memory, the self was born. This shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in through story, through reflection, through trauma and time. The first signs? Burials. When ancient people began to bury their dead with care, with tools, flowers, food, it wasn't just about honoring the body, it was a recognition of the person, a soul, a self, a life that mattered beyond its physical form. And what preserved that soul? Memory. The name, the deeds, the stories whispered over bones, the rituals, the songs. These weren't just traditions. They were the first attempts at identity preservation. Because if we can remember the dead, maybe we can remember ourselves. Fast forward to the Greeks. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle didn't just ask, "What is truth?" They asked, "Who am I?" And their answer always circled back to one thing: memory. Plato believed learning was remembering, a recollection of eternal truths from past lives. Aristotle saw memory as the basis of experience, reason, and character. And later, Roman thinkers took it further. Cicero wrote about memoria, not just as recollection, but as a virtue. To remember one's duties, one's lineage, one's place in the social order, that was the mark of a civilized man. But memory wasn't just philosophical. It became personal. In ancient China, Confucianism rooted identity in filial piety. Your role as son, brother, student, servant. Your worth was tied to how well you remembered your obligations. And in the West, Christianity introduced something radical. The idea that every individual soul was known by God, accountable, redeemable. And how was that soul judged? By memory. The book of life. The last judgment. The weighing of deeds. Suddenly, every act mattered. Every thought. Every sin. Memory wasn't just cultural, it was eternal. And this internalization shaped everything. By the Middle Ages, memory was no longer just an aid to knowledge. It became proof of character. Nobles kept family trees. Monks kept confession logs. Artists began signing their work not for fame, but to anchor their names in time. Because identity, once collective, was becoming individual. And memory was the glue. The Renaissance supercharged this. With printing presses came journals, autobiographies, and personal letters. People didn't just write history, they wrote themselves into it. Michel de Montaigne published the first modern essays, a new form of writing designed not to instruct but to reflect. To know thyself, he wrote, is the beginning of all wisdom. But knowing thyself required remembering thyself. Which brings us to now. In the digital age, identity is memory. Photos, posts, messages, likes, streams of information that say, "This is who I am." Your feed is your autobiography. Your search history, your second brain, your cloud storage, your museum. And while it gives us power, visibility, voice, validation, it also comes at a price. Because what happens when you can't forget? When every mistake is archived, every word is screenshot, every version of you lives on, even the ones you've outgrown. We used to rely on fading memory for forgiveness. Now, memory is permanent. And the self is trapped. In servers, in timelines, in algorithms. The question isn't who am I anymore? It's which version of me are you seeing? Because identity isn't stable. It's a negotiation between what we remember and what we wish we could forget. For most of human history, memory was fragile. It faded, it warped, it depended on people, fallible, mortal, emotional. A forgotten story could disappear forever. A burned manuscript might erase an entire civilization's wisdom. But then came machines. And suddenly, memory became immortal. It started innocently enough, with printing presses, typewriters, cameras, tools that helped us capture the world as it was, moments frozen in ink, paper, and film. But the real revolution began in the 20th century, when humans taught machines to store memory for us. Magnetic tapes, hard drives, cloud servers. We stopped just writing things down. We started outsourcing our minds. And the result? An explosion of memory, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Let's look at the scale. By 2020, the world had created more than 44 zettabytes of data. That's 44 trillion gigabytes, enough to fill 880 billion Blu-rays. And it's not slowing down. Every photo you take, every text you send, every voice note, GPS ping, Google search logged, tagged and stored somewhere. Forever. Because digital memory doesn't fade. It doesn't sleep. It doesn't forget. That changes everything. Historically, memory was selective. Your brain filtered out 99% of what you experienced. Only the essential survived. It had to. But digital memory doesn't filter. It hoards. It keeps everything relevant or not, good or bad, useful or toxic. And that creates a new kind of burden. Not the burden of forgetting, but the burden of too much remembering. Psychologists call this digital overload. It's the mental strain caused by endless information, notifications, updates, memories from years ago resurfacing without warning. 1 second, you're working. The next, a photo from 2015 reminds you of someone you lost. Because machines don't understand context. They don't know when to stop remembering. And the consequences run deep. Socially, we've lost the grace of forgetting. Old tweets resurface. Embarrassing moments haunt us. Mistakes become permanent records. In the past, time washed things away. Now, screenshots immortalize them. Legally, it's more complex. Who owns your digital memory? The platform? The user? The government? Can you erase it? Edit it? Does deleting a post truly delete it? Even when you die, your data often doesn't. Digital ghosts linger. Social media profiles, messages, videos, AIs trained on your voice. We've created afterlives of code. But the biggest shift of all? Machines don't just store memory anymore. They analyze it. Every search you make teaches an algorithm. Every click fine-tunes a feed. Every pause on a video tells a machine what you care about, even if you don't know it. Your digital memory becomes a map of your desires, your fears, your identity. And machines learn you better than you know yourself. They predict what you'll buy, who you'll date, what you'll think. They shape what you see, what you believe, what you remember. This isn't storage. It's manipulation. We've handed over the keys to our memory. And in return, we get convenience. But at what cost? What happens when your memories are filtered by profit? When your identity is curated by an algorithm? What happens when forgetting is no longer an option? Because for the first time in history, the past is no longer behind us. It's all around us. Living, breathing, clicking, refreshing. And the future? It's being built on a memory that wasn't made for humans. It was made for machines. In a world where everything is stored, where nothing is truly forgotten, another battle has begun. It's not about preserving memory. It's about the right to erase it. Because while memory once faded naturally, today's memory is engineered to last forever. And for some, that permanence is a prison. Think of it. A teenager posts something dumb, a joke, a rant, a mistake. 10 years later, that post resurfaces and costs them a job. A woman escapes an abusive relationship, but her digital footprint remains. Photos, addresses, tags, timelines. She can't truly leave. The internet remembers. A man clears his name after a wrongful accusation, but the search engine still links him to the crime. In the analog world, time gave you distance. In the digital world, time gives you exposure. Because algorithms don't forget. Bet, they resurface, recontextualize, reshame. So the question arises, do we have a right to be forgotten? In 2014, the European Court of Justice said yes. A man in Spain, Mario Costeja González, argued that Google should remove links to a decades-old newspaper article about his financial troubles. The information was outdated, irrelevant, and damaging his reputation. The court agreed, and thus, the right to be forgotten was born. It gave Europeans the ability to request removal of personal data from search results, if that data was no longer accurate, relevant, or necessary. But the ruling sparked outrage. Some called it censorship. Others called it justice. Some feared it would whitewash history. Others saw it as restoring dignity. Because here's the ethical paradox. If memory is a human right, shouldn't forgetting be one too? This debate is growing louder as surveillance expands. In China, the government uses facial recognition and social scoring to track behavior. One mistake, a fine, a protest, even jaywalking, can haunt you for life. Public screens display offenders, databases update in real time. It's not memory, it's control. In the West, it's subtler. Private companies collect everything: location, preferences, health, behavior. Your phone knows more about you than your doctor. Your watch tracks your heartbeat. Your apps log your sleep. And most of us, we click accept. Because the terms of service are long, and the price of convenience feels cheap. Until it's not. Until a breach leaks your messages. Until a prediction ruins your loan application. Until your memories, once yours, are used against you. So what do? Some are turning to digital hygiene, deleting old accounts, scrubbing timelines, using encrypted apps. Others are embracing data minimalism, a philosophy that says, don't just protect your memory, reduce it. But maybe the real answer is this. We need to rethink memory itself. Not as a trophy, not as a punishment, but as a right with limits. Because remembering everything isn't wisdom. Sometimes wisdom is knowing what to let go of. For most of human history, forgetting was a feature. It made room for new ideas. It healed old wounds. It allowed societies to adapt, evolve, and move forward. But today, forgetting has become a liability. Because in the modern world, memory makes money. And the more platforms, companies, and governments remember about you, the more they can profit. Let's unpack this. Every time you search something, scroll, like, pause, or click, you're creating a data trail. That trail is analyzed, categorized, and sold, often in real time. You become a memory profile, a digital persona built not from your words but your behavior. And that profile is incredibly valuable. Advertisers pay billions to target you, to reach you at the exact moment you're most likely to click. Not because they know you, but because your memory tells them everything. What you looked at last week, what you nearly bought yesterday. What video made you linger 3 seconds longer than usual? In the old world, memory was sacred. In the new world, it's a commodity. But there's a twist. This economy doesn't just use your memory. It feeds on it. And it creates platforms designed to be addictive engines of endless recall. Your past posts, your on-this-day memories, your photos from 10 years ago, they're not for you. They're hooks. Hooks to keep you scrolling, to trigger emotion, to re-engage the algorithm. Because nothing drives clicks like nostalgia. And nothing monetizes better than memory. Even your pain becomes profitable. Lost a loved one? You'll be shown memory reels. Had a breakup? The timeline still shows the photos. Changed your politics? The feed still remembers who you used to be. This isn't memory for healing. It's memory for revenue. And it changes how we live. We become performers in our own histories, curating our timelines, filtering our past, projecting idealized versions of ourselves, hoping the algorithm remembers us well. But that's not living. That's brand management. Even relationships are distorted. You meet someone new, and they already know your digital history, your photos, your tweets, your opinions from 5 years ago, opinions you might not even agree with anymore. There's no first impression anymore, just a search result. So we start to self-censor, not because we're hiding, but because we know. The memory machine is watching. And forgetting? That's no longer allowed, because every deletion is lost at revenue. Every data wipe is a missed opportunity. Every forgotten fact is a broken prediction model. So the system doesn't encourage forgetting, it punishes it. Think about subscription models. They trap you with memory. Your playlists, your libraries, your preferences, stored only if you stay subscribed, leave, and your memories disappear. Not because they have to, but because it's profitable to hold them hostage. This is the new contract. We give up forgetting. And in return, we get convenience, entertainment, personalization. But we also lose something essential. The ability to start over. To reinvent. to exist outside our archive. And the irony? We've created a world where memory is everywhere, and yet we feel more lost than ever. Because true memory isn't about storage. It's about meaning. And no algorithm can sell you that. As the world drowns in information, a strange thing is happening. We're remembering more than ever before. Photos, posts, messages, notifications, history, updates, everything. And yet, we understand less. Because when memory becomes infinite, its value becomes uncertain. This is the paradox of the digital age. In our quest to preserve everything, we've lost our ability to focus on anything. Let's go back. For most of history, memory was hard-earned. To recall a poem meant memorizing it line by line. To preserve a story meant retelling it faithfully, often for years. Every remembered fact had weight because forgetting was the default. Now, we store everything: emails, screenshots, receipts, documents, recordings. But what happens when everything is remembered and nothing is filtered? We start to collapse under the noise. Psychologists call this information fatigue syndrome. The brain, bombarded with memory triggers, becomes overwhelmed. It shuts down emotionally. It flattens nuance. That's why doom scrolling feels hollow. Why reading comments feels draining. Why 50 open tabs lead to no action. We remember, but we don't connect. Because memory without context isn't insight. It's chaos. Even history suffers. With access to millions of documents, we should be more informed than ever. But instead we argue more, not because of facts, but because of too many facts. Too many versions. Too many interpretations. Too many curated memories masquerading as truth. And in the fog of over-memory, the loudest voices win. Not the wisest. Not the most accurate. Just the most algorithmically optimized. So we cling to simple narratives. Echo chambers. A lump sum confirmation bias. Because nuance is too expensive. And the memory economy rewards certainty, not curiosity. This affects how we see others. We don't see people anymore. We see their archives. Old tweets. Past mistakes. That one bad take from 2012. We define them by snapshots, frozen in time. We don't allow growth. We don't allow forgetting. And the result? We cancel before we understand. We shame before we listen. We remember what suits our outrage. Even personally, this is toxic. We look back at our own digital history, not to reflect, but to compare. Why was I happier then? Why did I look better? Why was I more productive? We curate a memory reel that punishes us. Not because it's false, but because it's incomplete. Because no photo shows the anxiety behind the smile. No post captures the doubt behind the confidence. No timeline reveals the truth behind the trend. And slowly, we begin to forget how to live in the present. We become archivists of our own despair. So what's the way out? It might be this. We don't need to remember everything. We need to remember better. With purpose. With empathy. With room for silence and contradiction. Because sometimes, forgetting is an act of mercy. A space for growth. A tool for healing. Memory shouldn't be a trap. It should be a choice. The first great civilizations didn't just build temples and cities. They built archives. Not libraries as we know them, but clay tablets, stone engravings, and sealed scrolls buried in dry chambers. They weren't preserving stories for the people. They were preserving power. The earliest records from Mesopotamia weren't poems or philosophies. They were grain tallies, tax logs, legal disputes. Memory wasn't sacred. It was administrative. To remember who owed what, who ruled where, who disobeyed whom, that was control. The king's authority didn't just rest on the sword. It rested on the tablet. If it was written, it became law. If it wasn't, it didn't exist. This is where memory and power fused. In Egypt, scribes worked inside temples where hieroglyphs weren't just artistic, they were legal. Each carving a contract between gods and kings. Pharaohs immortalized themselves in stone, listing victories both real and exaggerated. What couldn't be proven didn't matter. What mattered was what was remembered, and only the powerful could afford to remember. The Great Library of Alexandria wasn't just a center of learning, it was an act of domination. Ptolemaic rulers ordered every ship docking in Alexandria to surrender its manuscripts for copying. The originals stayed, The copies were returned. Memory was seized, catalogued, controlled. To collect was to conquer. And when the library burned, once, twice, maybe even 3 times, centuries of knowledge vanished, whole languages lost, entire sciences forgotten. Not because no one cared, but because no one could stop memory from being so fragile. Later, the Islamic Golden Age in Baghdad created the House of Wisdom. Unlike Alexandria, this was not just hoarding but translation. Persian, Indian, and Greek texts reinterpreted, expanded, innovated. But even this renaissance was backed by rulers who decided which knowledge was worth funding, protecting, spreading. Memory blossomed only where it was politically convenient. The printing press was hailed as the democratization of memory. But Gutenberg's first major print job? The Bible. And what followed? State control, religious censorship, and decades of wars over which version of memory would be accepted. The Reformation wasn't just theological, it was a war of texts, competing versions of the past, printed, distributed, weaponized. Even today, national archives are not neutral vaults. They reflect state priorities. What gets declassified? What gets sealed for 50 years? Whose voice gets preserved in official history? And whose gets edited out? The creation of memory is rarely fair. It is curated, often biased, always incomplete. But there's a deeper issue. Archives give the illusion of completeness. We think, if it's not in the records, it didn't happen. But most of history, especially that of women, indigenous people, the poor, never made it into records. Not because they weren't important, but because they weren't the ones doing the recording. So the question becomes, if memory is stored only by the powerful, what kind of world do we remember? One where kings never lose. One where emperors don't bleed. One where the people stay quiet. That's the memory legacy we inherited. And it shapes how we view our place in history, not as active participants, but as observers of someone else's story. Today, digital archives promise to fix that. Everyone can store, everyone can record, but that doesn't mean equality, because storage isn't access, and access isn't interpretation. Google might index the world's knowledge, but its algorithm decides what you see. Wikipedia might be editable by all, but not all edits survive. Even in the digital age, memory is still filtered by code, by popularity, by the biases of the engineers who built the system. So while the world is archiving more than ever before, we're still asking the same ancient question. Who gets remembered? Who gets forgotten? And who decides? The archive isn't dead, it's just moved online, faster, bigger, but still a reflection of power. For communities without power, memory has never been a luxury. It's been a weapon, a lifeline, a means of resisting erasure. When the official archives exclude you, when the textbooks ignore you, when the monuments aren't built for you, memory becomes oral, embodied, performed. It's not stored in files, it's stored in families, passed in songs, hidden in metaphors. Because when your story isn't welcome in history, the only way to survive is to make memory portable. This is why enslaved Africans brought stories with them across oceans. Not just tales of gods and spirits, but codes, warnings, messages of defiance disguised as folklore. Because the plantation owner might take your name, your language, your children, but he couldn't take what lived in your memory. So you taught your history in rhythms, in steps, in melodies that sounded harmless but weren't. That was memory as resistance. The same happened in indigenous communities across the Americas, Australia, Africa. When colonial forces erased their records, renamed their lands, criminalized their languages, these communities turned inward. Their elders became the archives, their ceremonies, the record keepers. Every dance, every pattern, every oral genealogy wasn't just culture, it was defiance. Because forgetting in these contexts wasn't an accident, it was policy. Colonial governments intentionally dismantled memory. They burned documents, banned traditions, built schools, not to educate, but to replace. They called it civilizing. It was actually reprogramming. And yet, despite that, memory survived. The Jewish diaspora turned memory into ritual. Every holiday a story, every meal a mnemonic device. Why is this night different from all other nights? Because asking that question ensures the past never disappears. Not just the glory, but the trauma too. Even genocide could not erase memory when it was encoded in everything, from prayers to posture to calendar. For LGBTQ+ communities, memory has been erased by silence. For decades, queer history was hidden or rewritten. In medical files, queer identity was a diagnosis. in law books a crime, in literature a metaphor. But memory didn't die, it went underground. Zines, diaries, underground clubs, even the way people walked, dressed, signaled. These were cues in a shared history of survival. During the AIDS crisis, when the world looked away, it was memory of lovers, of marches, of rage that fueled activism. ACT UP, fight back, fight AIDS. That wasn't a slogan, it was a memory call. Memory isn't always an archive. Sometimes it's a refusal to accept the official story, to go silent, to let the past dissolve. The Black Lives Matter movement didn't invent outrage. It resurrected names. Trayvon, Sandra, George. It demanded the world not forget, because forgetting was the first betrayal. And platforms like Twitter and Instagram became the new oral tradition, hashtags as modern griots. Digital remembrance, not because it was trendy, but because it was necessary. But marginalized memory is always at risk, because it's not protected by systems. It's passed person to person, which means it can die with the last witness. That's why so many movements now scramble to record, to archive, to digitize, because memory without infrastructure is vulnerable. And when the last elder goes, or the language fades, or the website crashes, an entire world can vanish. Yet even with that risk, marginalized memory has something the archives don't. Soul, it's lived, felt. It's not passive, it's active. It demands participation, and that's why it persists. Because memory isn't just what you keep, it's what you're willing to carry. There's an old saying, history is written by the victors. But in the modern era, history isn't just written after the war, it's rewritten during peace. Governments don't need to wait for victory to shape the story. They do it every day, through laws, through media, through education, and most effectively, through memory control. Let's start with China. The 1989 Tiananmen Square protests ended in bloodshed. Thousands of students demanding democratic reform were met with tanks. The images of a man standing in front of a tank went viral across the world. But inside China, that image is practically unknown. The event is erased from textbooks, censored on social media, banned from public discussion. Most people under 30 in China have never even heard of it. It's not just forgotten, it's deliberately unremembered. Search Tiananmen in China, and you won't get horror, you'll get silence. That's not history. That's engineered amnesia. North Korea takes it further. There, memory isn't just controlled, it's fabricated. The country's official history claims its leaders performed supernatural feats. Kim Il-sung, they say, caused rain to stop and flowers to bloom. Kim Jong-il supposedly invented the hamburger. These are not eccentric myths. They are state-mandated memory constructs. And questioning them, that's treason. In Russia, memory is more subtle, but no less dangerous. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian state has selectively remembered Stalin. His purges and gulags are minimized. His role in defeating the Nazis is elevated. Statues of Stalin have been quietly re-erected. School books rebranded him as a strong leader who made mistakes. The deaths of millions, reframed as necessary for progress. That's historical revisionism cloaked in nostalgia. Even democracies engage in this. In the United States, public school curriculums differ state to state. One version of American history might emphasize slavery, civil rights, and indigenous genocide. Another might downplay those entirely in favor of patriotism and economic triumph. It's not just a matter of facts. It's about which memories are promoted and which are buried. Textbooks are battlegrounds. Statues, too. Every monument is a memory etched in stone. But not all memories deserve to be immortalized. That's why we've seen statues fall. Confederate generals, colonial conquerors, slave owners. Some see this as erasing history. But it's not erasure, it's reassessment. History stays, but public memory evolves. Yet governments resist. Why? Because control over memory is control over meaning. When you decide what a nation remembers, you influence how it behaves. You determine who gets honored, who gets blamed, and who gets ignored. Take Turkey. For decades, the country denied the Armenian genocide, where over 1 million Armenians were killed during World War I. Even mentioning it could lead to prosecution. For generations, memory was silenced. Only in 2021 did the United States formally recognize it as genocide. But inside Turkey, denial still dominates. That's not just about pride, it's about narrative control. In Japan, schoolbooks have been edited to soften the nation's role in World War II, particularly the atrocities committed in China and Korea. Comfort women. Biological experiments, massacres, these are downplayed or omitted entirely. The goal? A generation that remembers victory and resilience, but not shame. Why does this matter? Because memory shapes identity, and identity shapes policy. A country that remembers its sins may seek justice. A country that buries them may repeat them. Memory isn't just about the past. It's about what kind of future a society allows itself to imagine. The danger is that in the digital age, memory seems abundant. We assume everything is archived, accessible, permanent. But digital platforms are vulnerable. Data is deleted. Algorithms are biased. Content can be geofenced, throttled, shadow banned. Memory is still a gate-kept resource. The gatekeepers just changed. Governments no longer need to burn books. They just need to flood the feed, bury the truth in distraction, drown dissent in noise. And people overwhelmed simply scroll past history. So what do? We build counter-archives. We support independent journalism. We record the stories governments won't tell. We amplify marginalized voices. We remember not just what's convenient, but what's uncomfortable. Because uncomfortable memory is often the most honest. And most importantly, we ask, who benefits from this version of the past? Who is missing from this narrative? What does remembering cost? And what does forgetting protect? Because forgetting, in the hands of power, isn't innocence. It's a strategy. In today's world, identity isn't just something we inherit. It's something we build, curate, and project. And the raw material for that construction, memory, or more accurately, the version of memory we choose to share. Every profile bio, every post, every filtered photo is a fragment of identity, a decision about what to highlight and what to hide. And over time, these fragments become a brand, not necessarily for others, but for ourselves. The digital self becomes a feedback loop, reflecting and reinforcing how we want to be remembered. This didn't start with Instagram. It began with autobiographies, with public figures shaping their own narrative before anyone else could. Kings wrote about their victories, rebels penned manifestos, writers rewrote their childhoods to fit a theme. Memory became a performance, structured, stylized, and strategic. But now, everyone has a stage. We live in a world of microbiographies, daily updates, curated captions, milestone moments, birthdays, breakups, promotions, grief. We narrate ourselves in real time. And in doing so, we begin to remember ourselves differently. This isn't inherently fake, but it is selective. We remember the hike, not the argument. The vacation, not the anxiety before it. The win, not the work. And the more we scroll, the more we compare. Their joy, their growth, their perfect lighting, and suddenly our own memories feel insufficient. Not because they lack value, but because they lack presentation. So we adjust. We delete. We filter. We rewrite. And soon, the line between memory and marketing blurs. This is the personal brand economy, and memory is the currency. Even apologies are rehearsed. This is not who I am becomes the script. Redemption arcs get monetized. Tragedy becomes content. The past isn't just recalled, it's repackaged. And the pressure to maintain this narrative grows. Every new post must align with the old ones. Every opinion must fit the feed. Evolution becomes risky. Changing your mind is suspicious, because the internet never forgets and inconsistency is punished. But humans aren't consistent. We evolve. We contradict. We grow. That's what memory used to reflect. A messy, non-linear story of becoming. Now, it reflects a grid. Neat, palatable, monetizable. This branding of memory doesn't stop at individuals. Companies do it. They rebrand scandals, reframe failures, tell origin stories that skip the boring parts. Nations do it. They release documentaries, museum exhibits, cultural celebrations, all memory, all curated. Even movements are rebranded. Civil rights heroes once demonized become commemorated, but often in ways that neutralize their radical edge. Martin Luther King Jr., once under FBI surveillance, is now quoted by presidents who oppose the causes he died for. The memory is remembered. The message is tamed. So we must ask, whose story is being told? Who's controlling the edit? Because rewriting the self isn't just about self-expression. It's about memory control. The solution isn't to stop curating. That's human. But we need space for the uncurated self, for memory that doesn't perform, for stories that aren't optimized for engagement. Because if every memory is a marketing decision, then who are we really? Once upon a time, memory was communal. A tribe remembered together, a society shared a mythos. A country had textbooks, calendars, holidays, all synchronized. You didn't have to agree with the past, but you at least knew what it was supposed to be. Now, we live in a fragmented reality, and the first casualty of fragmentation is collective memory. It began with choice. The idea that you could choose your sources, your channels, your narratives. On paper, that's freedom. In practice, it's chaos. When everyone gets their news from different places, when algorithms tailor history to personal preferences, we stop remembering together. Two people can live in the same city and remember the same event. A protest, a policy, an election completely differently. Not because of opinion, because of exposure. One saw looting, one saw marching, one read violence, one read injustice. Their memories aren't interpretations, they're different realities. This isn't a glitch. It's the algorithm working as designed. Your feed is a memory silo. It shows you what confirms your views, what echoes your beliefs, what reinforces your identity. And soon your memory becomes insulated, immune to contradiction, incapable of cross-checking. This is called epistemic closure. When communities stop even considering other sources as valid, it's no longer "I disagree with you," it's "your memory is a lie." And when that happens at scale, society breaks. Not with gunfire, with confusion. The January 6th Capitol riot. Some remember it as an insurrection, others as patriotism, 9/11. Some see it as a day of mourning. Others see it as the start of endless war. Even the pandemic, a memory still unfolding, but already wildly different in shape depending on where you lived, what you watched, who you trusted. The collapse of collective memory leads to the collapse of collective action. Because how can we agree on what to do next, when we can't even agree on what just happened? Even history, long settled, is being relitigated. Slavery, colonialism, world wars, civil rights, the Holocaust, climate change, each one a battlefield of memory. Debates no longer about data, but about which memories are valid. Some try to unify through education, standardized curricula, national memorials, but even those are politicized. A curriculum becomes indoctrination, a monument becomes erasure, a museum becomes a narrative weapon. So what's left? Micro-communities? Online subcultures? Diasporas? Niche historians? Memory circles that share stories but only with each other. It's not inherently bad. Diversity of memory is healthy. But the danger is when no memory is trusted outside your bubble. We don't just distrust institutions, we distrust the very act of remembering. Deepfakes, AI-generated voices, fabricated videos, all make us doubt. Did that even happen? This leads to learned helplessness. Not apathy, but disorientation. If nothing is real, why bother remembering at all? But memory needs context. It needs grounding. It needs a minimum of shared reference points to mean anything. So how do we rebuild collective memory? Not by going backward, not by enforcing one version of truth, but by creating memory fluency, the ability to navigate multiple truths, hold complexity, recognize bias, and still find common ground. It means teaching people not just what to remember, but how memory works, where it comes from, who shapes it, why it matters. Because if we lose collective memory, we lose the ability to act as a collective. For most of human history, death was final. Your voice stopped. Your presence disappeared. Your memory lived on only through others. A name carved into stone, a story passed around a fire, a photo on a wall. Fragile, fading. But now, memory is digital. And death doesn't mean disappearing. Social media profiles stay online. Emails linger in inboxes. Voice notes, videos, photos, millions of data points all preserved. Your life becomes a file. Your memory, a permanent echo. Sometimes that echo comforts. A widow listens to her husband's voicemails. A son scrolls through his mother's feed. A best friend rereads messages from a friend who died too soon. The dead become more than memories. They become interfaces. But there's a darker side. Companies are now offering digital resurrection. AI-trained chatbots that mimic the dead. You upload old texts, emails, recordings, and the machine creates a version of your loved one that talks back, that learns, that evolves. It sounds like science fiction, but it's already here. One company trained an AI on thousands of conversations with a deceased man. His partner could keep chatting with his memory. At first it helped her grieve. Then she couldn't stop. The line between comfort and dependence blurred. This is called grief tech, and it's raising ethical questions humanity has never faced before. What does it mean to talk to the dead? Who owns your voice after you die? Can someone sue an AI version of a person? Can a digital ghost be turned off? So we used to say, rest in peace. Now memory doesn't rest. Even celebrities are brought back. Holograms of Tupac. Digitally de-aged actors in movies. Voices cloned for new content. The dead keep working, keep performing, keep earning. But is it memory? Or is it simulation? Is a person's memory the facts of their life, or the way they made us feel? Can code replicate soul? Even living people face this trap. We leave so much online that people assume they know us. Your posts, your photos, your playlists all build a digital persona. When you die, that persona lives on, but it's curated, frozen, incomplete. Your growth, your doubts, your contradictions, they're not saved, just the version you chose to share. So your memory becomes a museum of fragments, visited by those who mourn, or those who want to remember, or those who never knew you at all. And sometimes those memories are twisted. A person is judged not by their life, but by one tweet, one moment, one error. That version becomes the story. Because memory in the digital age isn't about depth. It's about visibility. The most replayed version wins. Even funerals are changing. Live-streamed, archived, memorial websites, #eulogies. Mourning now happens in real time, across continents, with emojis and comments. This is the new afterlife. Data that lingers. A presence without a heartbeat. So how do we die in a world that won't let us go? Maybe the real question is, how do we want to be remembered? Because that's the one thing we can still control. Not how long we last, but what kind of echo we leave behind. Memory used to be a human monopoly. You had to live it, witness it, recall it. Even when we wrote things down, the interpretation still came from people. But now, machines are learning to remember for us. Not just store data, but structure it, analyze it, summarize it, make sense of it. Welcome to the age of artificial memory. AI systems today can digest terabytes of information in seconds. Legal cases, medical records, historical texts, entire internet archives. What would take a human a lifetime to memorize, AI handles in milliseconds. It doesn't forget, it doesn't tire, and it doesn't care about context, unless we teach it to. But that's the issue. AI memory isn't neutral. It's trained, biased, built on datasets that reflect the world as it is, not as it should be. If racism exists in the data, AI learns it. If women are underrepresented in the data, AI reflects that too. So when machines become memory keepers, they also become memory distorters. Imagine an AI historian summarizing world events. What does it leave out? What does it prioritize? Whose version does it tell? These aren't technical questions. They're ethical. Because once AI becomes the default filter, its memory replaces ours. Already, search engines act as outsourced memory. You don't recall facts, you Google them. You don't remember dates, you ask Siri. You don't explore ideas, you get AI summaries. Efficient, yes, but also reductive. Because AI gives answers, not understanding. It presents conclusions, not contradiction. And what about AI that learns you? Recommendation algorithms. Remember your preferences. They shape what music you hear, what videos you watch, what news you see. Over time, they mold your identity, not just reflect it. Your digital memory feeds the system, and the system feeds you back a version of yourself it thinks you want to be. Then there's AI content creation. Chatbots writing essays, generators creating stories. Memory no longer comes from lived experience, it's assembled from patterns. A memoir written by a machine that never lived. A speech crafted by an algorithm trained on charisma. A poem by code. Is that memory or mimicry? AI is now being used to reconstruct the past. Voices of ancient civilizations, faces of historical figures, simulations of extinct languages. These can be tools for insight or tools for revisionism. Because if we can recreate memory, we can reinvent it. This opens doors and raises alarms. When AI fills in historical gaps, does it clarify the past or overwrite it? When deepfakes reanimate people, is that tribute or trespass? When synthetic media is indistinguishable from reality, who gets to decide what's true? There's another layer. AI doesn't just remember, it predicts. Based on your past, it forecasts your future. What you'll click, what you'll buy, even what you'll believe. That prediction becomes your next memory, and the cycle continues. This is predictive memory. Memory not just as archive, but as engine. So what do? We don't stop using AI, but we stop pretending it's objective. We recognize that every system remembers through a lens. That artificial memory is a reflection, flawed, powerful, and deeply human underneath the code. Because in the end, AI doesn't remember for us. It remembers what we taught it to. Memory is power. But power doesn't just preserve memory, it uses it, rewrites it, deploys it. And in the 21st century, memory has become a weapon, sharpened by media, deployed by leaders, and aimed straight at public perception. Political campaigns don't just promise the future. They invoke the past. Make America great again. Take back control. Return to glory. These aren't policies. They're memory plays. Nostalgia, not for a real past, but a constructed one. A version of history filtered through fear, pride, or pain. Authoritarian regimes use selective memory to maintain control. They highlight past enemies, heroic victories, ancient grievances. In Hungary, Viktor Orbán rewrites Hungary's past to fuel nationalism. In Russia, Vladimir Putin justifies invasions by invoking centuries-old territorial claims. It's not history, it's memory theater. In Israel and Palestine, generations are raised on conflicting memories. Maps, textbooks, memorial days, all teach different pasts. Each side remembers trauma, each side mourns loss, but the memories are incompatible. And when memory becomes identity, compromise becomes impossible. In Rwanda, memory was manipulated to justify genocide. Hutu extremists painted Tutsis as historical oppressors. Radio stations spread revisionist history. And in 1994, that manipulated memory helped fuel one of the fastest genocides in history. In the US, Confederate monuments were erected not immediately after the Civil War but during the Civil Rights era. Memory used to intimidate, to resist progress, to rewrite history in stone. Even corporations use memory. Since 1890, traditionally crafted, back to basics. It's not just branding, it's weaponized nostalgia. A way to manufacture trust through synthetic history. Social media accelerates this. Viral threads claiming history you weren't taught in school spread fast, often mixing truth with myth. Platforms incentivize emotion over accuracy, outrage over nuance. The more divisive the memory, the better it performs. And the result? We stop asking if something is true. We ask if it's usable. Does this memory support my side, my fear, my pride? If yes, we share it. If not, we dismiss it, even if it's factual. This is memory tribalism. A constant battle of narratives where the past is picked apart like a buffet. Heroes elevated, villains softened, events cherry-picked. Memory no longer builds bridges, it builds battlegrounds. And it's exhausting. Because in this war of memory, facts lose their weight. Every atrocity becomes politicized. Every historical trauma becomes weaponized. Even remembering becomes controversial. Some respond by retreating. Why can't we just move on? But memory doesn't work like that. You can't move on if the past was never acknowledged, if pain was never validated, if stories were never heard. Reconciliation requires shared memory, not shared opinion, just shared acknowledgement. That's why truth commissions exist, in South Africa, in Canada, in Colombia. They don't aim to erase disagreement. They aim to document pain, to create a memory that, while not unanimous, is at least undeniable. Because when memory is left to power alone, it stops being truth. It becomes a tool. Walk through any city, and you'll find memory hiding in plain sight. Not in books, not in data, but in buildings, street names, statues, public spaces. Infrastructure isn't just practical, it's ideological. Every city is an archive, a monument to what that society chose to remember and what it didn't. Think of Paris, wide boulevards carved through medieval neighborhoods, not for aesthetics, but to prevent barricades during uprisings, a city redesigned to suppress revolution and remembered as romantic. Think of Berlin, a city layered with trauma, bullet holes in buildings, memorials for the Holocaust, a preserved stretch of the Berlin Wall. The city forces you to remember. You can't walk its streets without confronting the past. Contrast that with places where history is paved over. In parts of the American South, plantations are now wedding venues, slave quarters refurbished as quaint cottages, the horror of slavery replaced by curated nostalgia, architecture used not to confront but to sanitize. In Tokyo, very little from World War II remains. The city was rebuilt, efficient, clean, modern, memory erased by design. In Warsaw, the opposite. The old town was rebuilt brick by brick to look exactly as it did before the war, a conscious act of memory reconstruction. What cities remember tells you what they value. Look at who gets a statue, who gets a street, whose name is carved in stone, whose is missing. These aren't coincidences. They're decisions often made by those in power, with specific intentions. This is why public monuments become flashpoints. Because a statue isn't just a tribute, it's a narrative claim. It says, this person matters, this version of the past is worth preserving, and when that narrative excludes or oppresses, the monument becomes contested. It's why statues fall. Confederate generals, colonial governors, slave traders. These aren't attacks on history. They're revisions of public memory, because history stays in books. But memory lives in concrete, and the stakes are real, because architecture isn't passive. It shapes how we move, how we feel, how we remember. A neighborhood erased becomes a culture forgotten. A building renamed becomes a legacy revised. This is urban amnesia, and it's dangerous, because cities are where most people live. If those cities forget or falsify memory, then millions grow up with a distorted sense of the past. But there's hope. New memorials are being built, not to glorify, but to mourn. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, honors lynching victims. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin is not celebratory. It's solemn, abstract, unsettling. These are spaces that don't tell you what to think. They make you feel what was lost. Cities can teach memory, or they can delete it. We have a choice. To keep building monuments to power, or to build spaces that invite reflection, complexity, honesty. Because when the architecture remembers, the people don't forget. We used to fear forgetting. Now we fear remembering everything. And not in the poetic, nostalgic sense, but in the relentless, exhausting flood of digital memory that never pauses, never filters, never sleeps. Welcome to the age of memory burnout. You wake up to notifications, memories from a year ago, a look-back video, messages you didn't answer, tabs you didn't close. The backlog grows, and none of it's urgent, but none of it's silent. Every platform begs you to remember, on this day, your year in review. Here's what you missed. The internet doesn't forget, and it doesn't let you either. This constant retrieval comes with a cost. Psychologists call it cognitive load. Your brain is forced to process old information, emotional triggers, unfinished loops. A photo from a dead friend, a message from an ex, a headline from a crisis. Each ping a portal back in time, unsolicited, unfiltered. In the analog world, memory was manageable. You kept a few boxes, a photo album, a diary. Memories lived in drawers. You chose when to revisit them. Now, they visit you, randomly, relentlessly. This isn't just nostalgia. It's re-traumatization. Because memory without context isn't reflection. It's intrusion. You didn't ask to remember that loss, that mistake, that version of yourself. But the algorithm thinks you'll engage, so it serves you pain like a feature. And it's not just emotional. Memory overload affects productivity. The more we store, the more we hesitate. Which version is correct? Which file is final? Which note is recent? We second guess. We duplicate. We scroll, but don't act. This is called information paralysis. Too much memory leads to too little motion. And the irony, we save more than ever, but find less. 1 million photos, but no time to sort. thousands of bookmarks, but none recalled when needed. We treat memory like insurance. Store it, forget it, feel safe. But uncurated memory isn't safety, it's clutter, and clutter is stress. Even grief changes. In the past, time faded memories, pain softened. Now, every photo can bring it back sharp. Every anniversary gets a push notification. The ghost in the machine isn't metaphor, it's literal. So people begin to purge, delete old messages, nuke photo libraries, quit platforms, not to forget but to breathe, to reduce the emotional noise. But even that feels risky. What if I need it? What if I regret deleting it? What if this version is the last trace? This is the paradox. We hoard because we fear forgetting, but the hoard prevents healing. So what's the answer? It's not full deletion, and it's not total retention, it's curation. Intentional memory. Choose what to keep, choose what to revisit. Give yourself permission to let some memories die. Not because they didn't matter, but because you mattered more. History isn't just what happened, it's what got remembered. And what got remembered was almost always shaped by who had the pen, who had the platform, who had the power. That's why history books feel incomplete, because they are. This is the memory gap. The distance between what happened and what survived. Millions of lives left unrecorded, generations of knowledge never written down, whole civilizations remembered only by their conquerors, and even then, often distorted. Think of the people who built the pyramids. Their names, unknown. The builders of the Great Wall, forgotten. The midwives, the farmers, the teachers, the poets. Everyday people who shaped the world and vanished from the record. Because memory is expensive. It requires tools, time, space, scribes, paper, education, and in most societies only the elite could afford to leave a trace. That's why ancient history is full of kings, pharaohs, generals, because they wrote about themselves, their victories, their lineages, the rest lost in time. But it's not just ancient. Ancient? Even in recent history, memory gaps persist. The contributions of women were routinely dismissed or absorbed into the credit of men. The labor of enslaved people was recorded only in ledgers. Indigenous knowledge was ignored until it was appropriated. Queer love hidden behind coded letters. Immigrant voices muted by language barriers and legal threats. And when records do exist, they're often inaccessible, locked in archives, written in languages most can't read, or buried under layers of bureaucracy and decay. The internet was supposed to fix this. A digital revolution. Everyone a documentarian, everyone a publisher. And yes, more people are sharing their stories than ever before. But the memory gap still exists. Why? Because platforms prioritize attention, not depth. Algorithms reward virality, not nuance. And the same biases persist. Stories told in English get boosted. Stories with slick visuals get shared. Stories from marginalized voices often get ignored again. Even worse, digital memory is fragile. Websites disappear. Links rot. Formats become obsolete. Data gets deleted. And unless someone backs it up, preserves it, curates it, the story dies. Not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't fit the platform's definition of value. The memory gap isn't just historical. It's happening right now. Entire communities living undocumented lives. Refugees without records. Undocumented workers without histories. People whose pain never makes it to a headline. That's why oral history matters. Zines matter. Podcasts, street interviews, protest signs. These are acts of memory reclamation. Not polished, not institutional, but real. That's why community archives matter. Local museums. Family photo albums. Elders who still tell stories face to face. These aren't just quaint, they're crucial. Because every time we close the memory gap, even slightly, we shift power, from silence to voice, from myth to complexity. And in doing so, we remind the world, history didn't just happen to the powerful. It happened to all of us. Strip away the jobs, the clothes, the devices, and what's left? Memory. Our identity isn't just what we do, it's what we remember. Your first heartbreak, your proudest moment, your greatest loss, your family's stories, the history of your people. All of that makes you. But memory isn't just personal, it's communal. a shared archive of stories, rituals, wounds, and triumphs. Memory tells you where you came from and who you belong to. That's why diasporas cling to tradition. Why immigrants pass on languages. Why resistance movements begin with remembrance. Before change, there must be context. And before context, there must be memory. Without it, identity drifts. Look at colonized nations where native tongues were outlawed, where ancestral religions were demonized, where maps were redrawn by strangers. Memory was attacked at the root because if you forget who you are, you're easier to control. And the aftershocks still ripple, generations disconnected from their own heritage. Young people unsure of their roots. Whole lineages broken by policies of forced forgetting. This is cultural amnesia, engineered, profitable, convenient for those in power. But individuals experience it too. Every time you're gaslit. Every time your story is doubted. Every time your experience is reframed by someone else's narrative, your memory is destabilized. And when your memory is unstable, so is your sense of self. Even therapy, at its core, is about recovering memory. Not just the facts, but the meaning behind them. Who hurt you? Who shaped you? Who made you believe what you believe? Healing is remembering differently. That's why memory is so fiercely defended. Why debates over statues, textbooks, terminology feel existential. Because they are. To remember differently is to become someone different. Even within families, this plays out. Ask siblings about the same childhood, and you'll get different versions. Not because one is lying, but because identity is shaped by interpretation. Memory is subjective. It's emotional. It changes with time, and yet it feels like truth. So when someone challenges your memory, it feels like an attack, not just on the past, but on your core. That's why reconciliation is so hard. Why political discourse fractures. Why cultural debates ignite. Because we're not just arguing about facts. We're protecting our sense of self. So how do we move forward? By honoring memory, but not idolizing it. By holding space for multiple truths. By recognizing that identity can evolve, and so can the memories that shape it. Because memory is not a prison. It's a blueprint. A foundation we can build on. And in a world constantly trying to erase or rewrite who we are, choosing what to remember may be the most powerful act of all. We're entering a world where forgetting becomes optional. Everything is stored, every moment documented, every sound, message, location, biometric signal saved, not just in photos or texts, but in data streams, in the cloud, in servers that never sleep. We call it convenience. But it's really a shift in how we experience time. The past used to fade. Now it lingers. It follows us. It taps us on the shoulder with memories from 5 years ago. It reminds us of relationships we ended, versions of ourselves we've outgrown. And in the future, it won't just remind us. It will predict us. Smart homes will remember your routines. Smart assistants will learn your moods. AI will anticipate your thoughts based on your past. Memory will no longer be retrospective. It'll be prescriptive. Your future decisions will be shaped by your archived behavior, not intuition, not reflection, but data patterns. And that changes everything. Dating apps will know your type before you do. Ads will anticipate desires you haven't yet formed. And career platforms will suggest jobs based on your past. Even if you want something new, your memory won't be just personal. It will be shared with systems. And those systems will shape your future in subtle ways. This creates a new kind of trap. What if your past self limits your future self? What if the things you did at 19 still define you at 40? What if mistakes become permanent tags? Not just on your conscience, but on your code. This is memory as metadata. It's not poetic, it's algorithmic. Not what you feel, but what the system remembers you did. And the scariest part? You might not know what's been remembered. Because digital memory isn't just infinite. It's invisible. Stored in places you'll never access. Analyzed in ways you'll never understand. This challenges not just privacy, but identity. If your digital trail becomes your definition, then who are you without it? What happens if that trail is hacked? Altered? Misinterpreted? We're used to thinking of memory as sacred, but in this future it's also exploitable. And it raises a question humanity has never had to face. Do we really want to remember everything? Because maybe memory was never meant to be complete. Maybe forgetting is what gives memory its shape, its function, its grace. Maybe the future isn't just about archiving everything. Maybe it's about deciding what to forget. Sometimes, forgetting isn't individual. It's collective, a whole society, over time letting go of a truth it once held, not because it was disproven, but because it became inconvenient, or uncomfortable, or simply buried under noise. This is collective amnesia, not a glitch but a feature of modern life. It happens slowly. The climate crisis used to feel urgent. Now, it's background noise, wildfires, floods, heat waves. We scroll past them. We normalize them. We forget last year's disaster in the shadow of this week's scandal. It happens structurally. And entire school systems gloss over colonial history. Whole countries teach sanitized versions of their past. Mass atrocities become footnotes. Victims disappear from the record. It happens digitally. Important stories vanish beneath viral trends. Memes outlive tragedies. Algorithmic feeds replace historical context with a dopamine rush. And once something's no longer shared, repeated, or taught, it slips. That's how atrocities repeat. Not because no one knew, but because no one remembered clearly enough to stop it. This forgetting isn't passive. It's often designed. Governments flood the media with distractions. Corporations promote the new so you'll forget the old. Even social movements, once powerful, fade without infrastructure to preserve their legacy. Occupy Wall Street, Arab Spring, Me Too. Remembered? Sort of, but diluted, fractured, reduced to hashtags, divorced from their full meaning. This isn't just tragic. It's dangerous. Because when a generation forgets, truly forgets, it loses more than facts. It loses the tools to make sense of the present. It repeats mistakes. It falls for old tricks. It becomes vulnerable to manipulation. So how do we fight amnesia? With rituals of remembrance, anniversaries, archives, documentaries, street art, oral history. We retell not to dwell but to anchor. We keep names alive. We pass on stories. We question narratives. We protect inconvenient truths. And we teach that memory isn't just a personal act. It's a social responsibility. Because every time we forget together, someone profits. But every time we remember together, someone is held accountable. We've spent this series exploring memory. Its power. Its fragility. Its manipulation. Its limits. We've seen how it's preserved. How it's weaponized. How it's erased. And how it survives. But in the end, the most important truth about memory isn't technological or political. No, it's personal. Memory is a choice. Not what happened, but what we choose to carry, what we're willing to face, what we're brave enough to repeat. Because memory isn't passive. It's a decision we make every day, to speak up when others go silent, to ask uncomfortable questions, to listen to those who are silenced, to preserve not just the pretty parts, but the painful ones. You don't need to be a historian, or a journalist, or an archivist, to protect memory. You just need to care. To care that people matter, that stories matter, that truth matters, even when it's messy. Because if we only remember what's convenient, if we only celebrate what's clean, if we only share what flatters us, then we've reduced memory to propaganda. But if we remember with curiosity, with humility, with courage, then memory becomes more than a mirror. It becomes a map, a way to navigate who we are, where we've been, where we're going. We can't change the past, but we can change what we do with it. And that, more than any archive, algorithm, or monument, is what makes memory matter. Thank you for walking through this journey. If memory is the thread that connects us, then this was one way of weaving something worth remembering.